He stole my recipes, my name, and my restaurant, so I took back everything. My name is Marin Ellison, and for 6 years, the smell of brown butter and seared scallops meant home to me. It still does, actually. What changed is who gets to walk through the door of the restaurant that smell belongs to. I grew up in my grandmother's kitchen in a narrow row house outside Providence, Rhode Island, standing on a step stool so I could reach the stove while she called out instructions in a voice roughened by 60 years of cigarettes and simmering stock. She never wrote a recipe down in her life. Everything lived in her hands, her nose, the exact sound a pan makes right before it's ready. I inherited that. I didn't inherit money or connections or a culinary degree, just her instincts and a stubbornness that would later cost me almost everything. By 26, I was running the kitchen at a mid-tier bistro in Portland, Maine, the kind of place with water-stained menus and a walk-in cooler that hummed like a dying refrigerator truck. I hated it. I loved cooking too much to keep cooking someone else's food. So I started building my own menu on index cards. I kept in a cigar box, a burnt honey and thyme glaze for duck breast, a charred corn agnolotti with brown butter and sage that I'd tested probably 11 times before it felt right, a cast iron cornbread with smoked paprika and Maine sea salt that my grandmother would have recognized instantly as hers, just sharpened. That's when I met Derek Voss. Derek had the kind of presence that filled a room before he opened his mouth. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked sculpted for restaurant openings, and a gray wool coat he wore like a costume even indoors. He'd worked front of house at two well-reviewed restaurants in Boston, and he talked about concept and narrative and brand voice, the way I talked about reduction times. He didn't cook. He didn't need to. He said he'd found people who could cook their whole careers. What he was looking for was someone who could cook something worth talking about. He found me on a slow Tuesday night, eating at the bar of the bistro where I worked, tasting a dish I'd smuggled onto the specials board without permission. He asked who made it. I said I did. He asked if I'd ever thought about owning something instead of just cooking in it. I hadn't eaten in 6 hours, and I said yes before I even finished chewing. We signed papers 8 months later. 50-50 partnership, his name and mine on the LLC, a restaurant called Ember and Salt tucked into a renovated fish cannery on the Portland waterfront, exposed brick still faintly smelling of salt and creosote from its old life. I designed every plate. I trained every line cook. I stood at that pass for 14-hour shifts in a chef's coat damp through the shoulders, tasting sauces off a spoon with my eyes closed, adjusting a pinch of salt at a time until a dish felt like it does in my memory of my grandmother's kitchen. Derek ran the front of house, the Instagram account, the investor dinners. He was good at that. I'll give him that much. For 2 years, it worked. Ember and Salt got written up in Down East magazine. A food blogger called my burnt honey duck the best plate in Portland, full stop. We had a wait list on Friday nights that stretched onto the sidewalk in the cold, and Derek would walk the line in his gray coat, shaking hands, telling guests the story of how he discovered the chef. I let that slide more than I should have. I told myself the story didn't matter as long as the food did. Then, in March, Derek started asking questions that felt different. He wanted to know exact ratios. He wanted the agnolotti filling recipe typed up for insurance purposes, in case anything ever happened to me. An accident, he said. God forbid, but you always want a backup. He asked me to walk our newest line cook, a quiet, sharp-eyed kid named Tyler Brennan, through the burnt honey glaze step by step, videoing it for training. I didn't think anything of it. I trusted him. That was my first mistake, and I'd repeat it for another 4 months. In July, I took 9 days off, the first real break I'd taken in 2 years, to fly to Rhode Island for my grandmother's funeral. She died the way she lived, quietly, in the middle of the night, in the same row house where she taught me everything. I stood at her graveside in the July heat, in a black dress that didn't fit right anymore because I'd lost weight. I didn't know I'd lost, and I thought about how much of her was still in every dish I made. I came back to Portland on a Thursday. I walked into Ember and Salt at 4 in the afternoon, ready to prep for service, and found the locks changed. Derek was standing in the dining room when the new manager let me in to collect my knives. My own personal set, the ones with my grandmother's initials scratched into the handles. He wore the gray coat. He told me, almost gently, like he was doing me a favor, that the investors had concerns about consistency during my absence, that they'd voted to restructure, that my equity had been diluted by a funding round I was never told was happening, down to 11%, and that going forward, the kitchen would be run by their new executive chef. The new executive chef was Tyler Brennan, cooking my burnt honey duck, my charred corn agnolotti, my grandmother's cornbread, now listed on the menu as Voss family cornbread, a detail so absurd I actually laughed out loud in that dining room once, sharp and humorless, before the manager asked me to leave. I found out later, much later, from a line cook who still texted me out of guilt, that Derek had spent those 9 days I was burying my grandmother meeting privately with our two silent investors, presenting my recipes as house intellectual property, and offering them a restructured deal that pushed me to a minority stake with no operational control. He'd filmed Tyler learning my recipes for exactly this reason. He'd been building the paperwork for months. The insurance question, the video, all of it. I just hadn't recognized what a knife looks like when it's still in the sheath. For 2 months, I did the thing you're not supposed to do, which is nothing. I picked up shifts at a diner. I cried in my car in a Hannaford parking lot more than once. I thought about the 11% and the cornbread with his name on it, and I felt something in me go very still and very cold, the way brown butter looks right before it turns. Then I remembered the cigar box. Every recipe Derek presented as house intellectual property existed first as handwritten index cards in my own handwriting, dated, with my testing notes in the margins. 11 attempts at the agnolotti, dated and time-stamped in a food journal I'd kept since I was 19 years old, long before Ember and Salt existed. Long before Derek Voss ever ordered a plate at that bar in Portland. I still had the cigar box. I'd had it the entire time. I'd just been too devastated to think about what it meant. I brought the cigar box, the journal, and 6 years of dated photographs to an intellectual property attorney named Rosalind Okafor, who specialized, almost too perfectly, in disputes between restaurant partners. She looked through 11 years of my dated culinary development with the flat, focused expression of someone who has seen exactly this story before and knows precisely how it ends. She told me the paperwork Derek filed with our investors wouldn't survive contact with a filed provenance claim. She told me his insurance video of Tyler learning my glaze technique was, if anything, evidence against him, proof the recipe existed and was mine before it was ever house property. We filed in September. Not a lawsuit first, a formal notice to the investors, laying out the provenance, laying out exactly how Derek had misrepresented recipe ownership to secure his restructuring vote. Silent investors do not stay silent when they realize the man who diluted a founding chef's equity may have exposed them to a fraud claim they didn't sign up for. The investors called an emergency meeting in October. I wasn't in the room, but I know what happened, because Rosalind was, and because 2 of the investors reached out to me directly afterward. Derek's restructuring vote was reversed. My equity was restored, and then some. The investors, protecting themselves, pushed for my majority operational control as a condition of staying in the deal at all. Derek was given 30 days to divest his stake entirely or face a joint fraud claim from both his own investors and from me. He chose to divest. He didn't have a choice. Not really. Not once the gray coat stopped being enough to charm a room that had started asking its own questions. I walked back into Ember and Salt on a cold morning in November, alone, before the staff arrived. The dining room smelled like someone else's cooking, thinner, less sure of itself. I went straight to the kitchen, put on my coat, the one with my own name stitched over the pocket, and I stood at the pass for a long moment, just breathing in the space my grandmother's food had built. We took Voss off the cornbread that afternoon. It's just cornbread now. Mine. Hers. Ours. Derek Voss hasn't opened another restaurant in Portland. I heard he's selling wine somewhere in Boston, telling people at parties about the place he used to run on the waterfront. I don't think about him much anymore. I think about my grandmother's hands and the smell of brown butter and the sound a pan makes right before it's ready. If you've ever had someone try to take credit for something only you built, you understand exactly why I slept better the night I got my name back over that kitchen door than I had in the entire 2 years it was missing. If this story hit home, hit like on this video and subscribe to Karma Served. We've got a lot more stories just like this one coming, and you won't want to miss what's next.